My sister accused my son of cheating at his award ceremony. Then I exposed her at the board meeting. My name is Vanessa Kessler. I am 37 years old, and I was standing in the third row of a school auditorium, camera raised, watching my 12-year-old son Milo walk up to accept first place in the Regional Robotics Innovation Award when my sister Deanna took the microphone from the MC's hand before I could even lower my phone. "I just want to say something quick," she said, smiling at the crowd the way she always smiled right before she said something designed to hurt. "It's wonderful, but let's be honest. It helps when your mom works for the district and knows exactly which judges to talk to." The room went quiet in that specific way. A room goes quiet when everyone is deciding whether to laugh or gasp. My son's face, up on that stage, changed in front of 300 people. He looked at me. I looked at Deanna. And in that exact moment, I thought about a folder sitting on my desk at home, one I had built 2 weeks earlier for an entirely different reason, one that had absolutely nothing to do with robotics and everything to do with the foundation our late father had left behind. The one Deanna had been quietly bleeding dry for over a year. I want to tell you what was in that folder and why. 7 days after that microphone moment, my sister sat in a boardroom with her hands shaking while a forensic accountant read her own signature back to her. But first, tell me where you're watching this from tonight, and whether you've ever had someone in your own family try to make your child's success sound like a crime. If that sentence landed anywhere in your chest, stay with me and subscribe. Because what happened next is the reason I stopped protecting people who never once protected me. I need to take you back, because the microphone moment wasn't really about robotics at all. It was the newest layer of something that had been building for over 30 years. Deanna is 4 years older than me, and for as long as I can remember, my achievements had a strange effect on her, one that never made sense to me as a child and made perfect sense to me as an adult. Anything good that happened to me needed an explanation that made it smaller. Scene 1. I was 9 and I won the school spelling bee. Deanna told our parents in front of me that the words were obviously easier for the younger kids, even though we'd competed in the same age bracket that year. Our mother laughed it off as sisterly teasing. I remember standing there holding my little certificate, feeling the wind shrink in my hands. Scene 2. I was 16 and I got into an honors program Deanna had applied for and been rejected from 2 years earlier. She told everyone at a family dinner that the program had lowered its standards that year. Nobody corrected her. I sat there quietly eating dinner, letting the comment pass, because correcting her always turned into a bigger fight than the comment itself was worth. Scene 3. I was 26, newly promoted at the school district office, coordinating academic programs across 3 schools. Deanna, unemployed at the time, told our extended family I'd only gotten the job because I knew how to network, in a tone that made networking sound like something dirty. I let that one go too, the way I let everything go, because keeping peace in that family had always meant absorbing whatever story Deanna needed to tell about me. Scene 3.5, because I think about it more than the others. When our father passed away 6 years ago, he left behind a small educational foundation he'd built over decades, a scholarship fund for first-generation college students in our hometown, something he was deeply proud of. In his will, he named both Deanna and me as co-directors, equal decision-making power, equal access to the foundation's accounts. At the reading of the will, Deanna cried and said how honored she was to carry on his legacy. I remember believing her completely. I had no reason not to. Scene 3 3/4, one more that I think explains something the earlier ones didn't. When I was 32, I applied for and won a small community grant to run an after-school tutoring program at the same elementary school we'd both attended as girls. It was modest, a few $1,000s, mostly used for supplies and a part-time coordinator, but it meant a great deal to me since I'd been quietly wanting to give something back to that school for years. Deanna showed up to the launch event uninvited, stood near the back during my short speech, and afterward told a cluster of parents, well within my hearing distance, that she'd actually suggested the idea to me originally over a family dinner months earlier, a conversation that had never happened. I remember the specific heat that rose in my face standing there, not anger exactly, more a kind of tired disbelief that she would reach for credit even in a room full of people who had no reason to care whose idea it was. I didn't correct her that night either. I smiled, thanked the parents for coming, and drove home replaying her sentence over and over until I fell asleep. Scene 4, the one that actually mattered. 14 months ago, doing routine year-end paperwork for the Foundation's tax filing, I noticed a discrepancy in the scholarship disbursement records, a gap between the amount our accountant listed as distributed to students and the amount that had actually left the Foundation's main account. It wasn't large enough to seem alarming at first glance, just under $6,000, easy to write off as an accounting error. I asked Deanna about it over text. She told me she'd handle it with the accountant and asked me not to make a big deal out of a small clerical thing. I let it go, the way I always let things go, and told myself it was probably nothing. That was the moment I now understand as the real beginning, though I didn't recognize it as one at the time. Not the microphone at Milo's ceremony. That $6,000 gap, glowing quietly on a spreadsheet 14 months earlier, was the first, thread of something I hadn't yet let myself pull. I want to be honest about why I didn't pull it sooner. Some part of me didn't want to know. Deanna was still my sister. Our father had trusted both of us with something he loved. I told myself that questioning her meant questioning his judgment in choosing us both, and I wasn't ready to carry that weight on top of everything else. 2 months before Milo's award ceremony, the gap reappeared, this time larger, just over $11,000, in the same category. Scholarship disbursements that didn't match what students had actually reported. Receiving. I remember sitting at my kitchen table that night with the Foundation's spreadsheet open on my laptop, the numbers glowing in the dark kitchen, feeling something shift inside me that had nothing to do with anger yet. It was closer to dread, the specific kind you feel right before you understand something you already suspected, but haven't let yourself say out loud. I didn't confront Deanna that night. I did something I had never done in 37 years of managing this relationship. I opened a blank document on my laptop and started writing down dates. I want to walk you through exactly what that document became over the following weeks, because this is where the story stops being about a microphone and starts being about proof, the kind that doesn't care how charming someone is in a room full of people. The first thing I did was request read-only access to the Foundation's full banking history for the past 18 months, which I was legally entitled to as co-director. I logged in myself rather than asking the accountant to summarize it for me because I wanted to see every transaction with my own eyes, in the order it actually happened, not the order someone else chose to present it in. What I found took my breath away in a way spreadsheets rarely do. 7 separate transfers over 18 months, moved from the Foundation's scholarship account into a secondary account labeled in the Foundation's own internal system as Program Administration, a category that, as far as I understood from our father's original bylaws, was meant to cover printing costs, event space rentals, and modest administrative stipends, nothing close to the totals I was now looking at. Combined, those 7 transfers totaled just over $43,000. I pulled the Foundation's original bylaws, the document our father had drafted himself with an attorney 15 years earlier, and read through the administration budget cap line by line. It capped annual administrative spending at $4,000, adjusted modestly for inflation. $43,000, spread across 18 months, was not a rounding error. It was more than 10 times what our father had ever intended that account to hold. Before I ever picked up the phone to call an attorney, I spent an entire Saturday alone at my kitchen table with the Foundation's account history printed out in front of me, because something in me needed to see the numbers on paper, physically, before I could accept what my screen kept showing me every time I logged in. I remember the specific sound of the printer finishing each page, the stack growing heavier next to my coffee cup, and I remember running my finger down each column, comparing dates to a small paper calendar I'd sketched out myself, marking every date Deanna had asked to borrow money informally over the past 2 years, every family favor, every just this once text that had always come with an apology attached, and never once came with a repayment date attached. By the time I finished, the calendar told its own story, even before any forensic accountant ever touched it. Nearly every one of those informal asks lined up within a week or two with one of the larger transfers I'd later confirm in the official records. I called a nonprofit compliance attorney the next week, a measured, precise man named Gerald Achebe, who had handled cases involving family-run foundations before. He asked me one question before anything else. He asked, "Do you want to fix this quietly within the Foundation's own governance structure, or do you want this handled as a legal matter from the start? Because those are 2 very different paths, and only one of them protects the Foundation itself if this turns out to be what it looks like." I told him I wanted to protect what my father built, above everything else. He said, "Then we move carefully, and we let the accounts tell the story before anyone else gets a chance to tell it for them." The first thing Gerald had me do was request a formal forensic accounting review of the foundation's finances, conducted independently outside of our regular accountant, since I no longer felt certain that our regular accountant, who Deanna had originally hired years earlier without much input from me, was someone whose numbers I could take entirely at face value. The forensic accountant, a careful woman named Priya Natarajan, spent 3 weeks going through every transaction, every scholarship application, every disbursement record, cross-referencing them against actual student enrollment confirmations from the colleges those scholarships were meant to fund. What she found didn't just confirm the missing $43,000. It uncovered something worse. 2 of the 7 program administration transfers totaling $9,000 had actually been routed, through 2 intermediate transactions designed to obscure the final destination, into a personal checking account belonging to Deanna's son, my nephew, who was 17 and had applied to the very same foundation scholarship the year before, under an application that, Priya's review confirmed, had been marked internally as approved despite never having gone through the standard 3-person CIFR review committee our father's bylaws required for every single award. I sat with that finding for a long time before I let myself fully understand it. My sister hadn't just been quietly overspending an administrative budget. She had funneled money meant for first-generation college students in our community, the exact cause our father had built this foundation to serve, into an approval for her own son, bypassing the review process entirely, while telling me for over a year that any discrepancies I noticed were small clerical things, not worth making a big deal over. Gerald told me the next step needed to happen through the foundation's actual governance structure, not through a family conversation. Under the bylaws, any co-director suspected of financial misconduct could be formally suspended pending investigation by a 2/3 vote of the Foundation's advisory board, a 5-person volunteer body our father had appointed years earlier, made up of former colleagues and 1 longtime family friend, none of whom, importantly, were related to either of us. Before that vote could happen, though, the bylaws required formal written notice to be delivered to the accused co-director, along with the evidence supporting the concern, giving them an opportunity to respond in writing before the board convened. Gerald drafted that notice carefully, factually, without a single accusatory word beyond what the forensic findings themselves stated. It listed the 7 transfers, the dates, the amounts, the routing through the intermediate accounts, and the bypassed review committee on my nephew's application, and it requested a written response within 10 business days. I sent that notice on a Thursday afternoon, 4 days before Milo's award ceremony. I didn't mention it to Deanna outside of that formal letter. I didn't call her, I didn't text her. I let the document speak entirely on its own, the way Gerald had told me it needed to, because the moment I said anything informally, she would have time to build an explanation around it before the board ever saw the evidence in its original unfiltered form. I think now that the microphone moment at Milo's ceremony 4 days later wasn't a coincidence at all. I think Deanna had received that formal notice, understood exactly what it meant, and reached, in the most public setting she could find on short notice, for the only weapon she'd ever really had against me, making my success sound smaller, making it sound stolen, in front of an audience that had nothing to do with any of it. I want to describe what that moment actually felt like, standing in that auditorium, because I think it matters for understanding what came after. The overhead lights were too bright, the way school auditorium lights always are, catching the dust in the air above the stage. Milo's trophy, small and plastic and completely genuine, caught that light too, glinting slightly as he held it, frozen, looking out at me instead of at the crowd applauding him seconds earlier. I remember the particular silence that followed Deanna's comment, thick and awkward, broken only by someone's chair creaking 3 rows back. Somewhere behind me, another parent whispered something I couldn't fully make out, and I remember feeling the specific heat of 300 people's attention shifting briefly, from my son's achievement to my sister's accusation, as if the 2 things belonged in the same sentence at all. I remember my own heartbeat in my ears for a moment, loud enough that I almost missed the MC's uncertain half-laugh into the microphone, the kind adults make when they don't know whether something was a joke. I remember deciding, in the space of maybe 2 seconds, that I would not give Deanna the version of this moment she clearly wanted, one where I raised my voice, where I made a scene equal to hers, where the story people told at dinner that night. became about two sisters arguing on a middle school stage instead of about a 12-year-old boy who'd spent 4 months soldering wires in our garage. I remember walking up to the stage myself, taking the microphone gently from Deanna's hand, not raising my voice, and saying only, "Congratulations, Milo. You earned every bit of this," before handing the microphone back to the MC and walking my son off that stage myself. I didn't argue with Deanna in that auditorium. I didn't need to. I already knew what was waiting for her in 7 days. Sitting in a folder Gerald and Priya had already finished building, days before she ever picked up that microphone. The 10 business days for her written response passed. With a single email sent to Gerald's office, not to me directly, denying any wrongdoing and claiming the transfers were informal reimbursements for expenses she'd personally covered on the foundation's behalf over the years, expenses she said she simply hadn't kept detailed receipts for. She made no mention at all of her son's scholarship application, the bypassed review committee, or the intermediate account routing, the two pieces of evidence Priya's forensic review had documented most precisely. That silence on the two most serious findings told Gerald everything he needed to know. He forwarded her response to the advisory board along with Priya's full forensic report and scheduled the formal board meeting for the following week, the one Deanna would eventually walk into, fully expecting, I believe, to charm her way through. The same way she'd charmed her way through every family disagreement for 30 years. I want to walk you through that board meeting carefully, because this is the part of the story people expect to be loud, and it wasn't. It was the quietest, most controlled hour of the entire ordeal, and that quiet was exactly what made it unbearable for Deanna to sit through. The night before, Gerald called me to walk through what to expect, and I remember sitting on my back porch in the cool evening air, phone pressed to my ear, watching Milo through the kitchen window doing homework at the counter, completely unaware of what was happening in a conference room he'd never see the inside of. Gerald told me my only job the next day was to stay quiet unless directly asked a question, to let Priya's numbers do everything the moment required, and to remember that a board built out of people who loved my father wouldn't need convincing, so much as they would need clarity. I told him I understood. I didn't sleep particularly well that night anyway. Not from nerves about the outcome, which by that point felt as settled as numbers can make anything feel, but from the strange grief of knowing that whatever happened in that room the next day would be the last time Deanna and I occupied a room together as anything resembling family. The meeting was held in a small conference room at the community center our father used to rent for the foundation's annual scholarship dinners, a detail I don't think was lost on either of us. 5 advisory board members sat around the table. Gerald sat beside me, not speaking for me, only present to answer procedural questions if needed. Priya presented her findings herself, in the same careful, unemotional tone she'd used with me weeks earlier, walking the board through each of the 7 transfers, the intermediate account routing, and the bypassed review committee on my nephew's application, referencing specific dates, specific document exhibits, specific bank confirmation numbers projected on a small screen at the front of the room. Deanna sat across from me, and I watched. Her expression shift as Priya moved through the presentation, watched the same practice charm she'd used at that microphone 4 days earlier slowly fail to find any room to operate in a meeting built entirely out of exhibits and timestamps. She tried once to interrupt Priya's presentation, saying something about how numbers can be twisted to tell any story you want, and the board's longtime family friend, a retired school principal named Adeline Reyes, who had known our father for 30 years, said only, "Deanna, these aren't twisted. These are your own account numbers matched against your own son's application file. Let her finish." Deanna didn't interrupt again. When Priya finished, the board chair opened the floor for Deanna to respond directly. She tried the same explanation she'd emailed Gerald earlier, the informal reimbursement story, but this time, sitting across from 5 people who had personally known our father and personally cared about what this foundation was supposed to do. The explanation didn't land the way it might have landed at a family dinner table. One board member asked her plainly why, if these were legitimate reimbursements, none of the 7 transfers appeared anywhere in the foundation's expense reporting system, a system Deanna herself had set up years earlier and trained our accountant to use. She didn't have an answer for that. The room held that silence for what felt like a very long time, the kind of silence Gerald had told me, weeks earlier, that documents alone could create, no raised voices required. The board's vote was unanimous. Deanna was formally removed as co-director of the foundation, effective immediately, with the matter referred to outside legal counsel to determine whether restitution or further legal action would follow regarding the misappropriated funds and the bypassed scholarship review. I want to be honest about how I felt sitting in that chair when the vote was read aloud. Not triumphant, not the way movies make moments like that feel. Just still, in a way I hadn't been still in months, maybe longer. Priya later told me something that stuck with me long after the meeting ended, sitting in her small office weeks earlier while she walked me through her draft findings before they ever reached the board. She said that in most cases like this, the person moving the money doesn't think of it as stealing while they're doing it. They think of it as borrowing against something they believe, somewhere in their own head they're owed. I asked her if she thought Deanna believed that. She said she couldn't speak to what anyone believed, only to what the numbers showed, and that the numbers, in this case, showed a pattern too deliberate and too well-timed to be explained by carelessness alone. The intermediate routing on the two transfers tied to my nephew's application, she pointed out, wasn't the kind of thing that happens by accident. Someone had to choose to move money through a second account before it reached a third, a step that served no purpose except to make the final destination harder to trace on a casual glance. The restitution process moved forward in the weeks that followed, largely outside of my direct involvement, exactly the way Gerald had structured it to. The Foundation's outside counsel formally requested repayment of the $43,000, with a structured timeline, and separately flagged the bypassed scholarship award for review by the district attorney's office, given that it involved funds designated for a nonprofit's stated charitable purpose being redirected, at least in part, to a family member of the person controlling the account. I didn't push for that referral myself. It happened because the bylaws required certain findings to be reported once they crossed a specific dollar threshold, and $43,000 crossed it clearly. My nephew's scholarship, once reviewed properly by the standard three-person committee that should have evaluated it in the first place, was found not to meet the Foundation's basic eligibility criteria at all, since his family's income at the time of application exceeded the Foundation's stated threshold for first-generation financially demonstrated need, the exact criteria our father had built this entire foundation around. The award was formally rescinded, and the funds already dispersed were added to the restitution total Deanna now owed. Word moved through the wider family the way it always does, whether anyone tries to control it or not. I didn't post anything. I didn't send an email to extended relatives laying out every detail. But Foundation Board minutes are, by our father's own design, part of the public record for the nonprofit's annual filings, since he believed transparency was part of what made the Foundation trustworthy in the first place. Anyone who wanted to look could find exactly what happened in plain language with dates attached. Several cousins did look, apparently, because within a month, the tone of certain family conversations shifted in ways I had no part in orchestrating. And see, Uncle, who hadn't spoken to me in nearly 2 years, mostly because he and Deanna had always been close, sent me a short message that simply read, "I read the filing. I'm sorry I didn't ask more questions sooner." I didn't respond with anything, beyond a thank you. I wasn't interested in relitigating 30 years of family dynamics through a text thread, and I think by that point I had finally learned the difference between accepting an apology and needing to extract one. A cousin who had been sitting near us at Milo's award ceremony told me later that she'd overheard 2 other parents in the parking lot afterward, before any of this became public record, wondering aloud whether Deanna's comment had sounded like someone trying to get ahead of something. I hadn't told a single person outside of Gerald's office and the Foundation's board what was actually happening. It seemed the truth, once it existed in real documents, had a way of moving on its own current, the way water always finds the lowest point in a room without anyone needing to carry it there by hand. I want to be honest about something else, the same way I've tried to be honest through all of this. At no point in this entire process did I feel the pull to make sure everyone at every future family gathering knew the worst possible version of what Deanna had done. I didn't need to manage the story anymore. I had spent decades absorbing whatever version of events Deanna needed people to believe about me. I had no interest in spending the same energy in reverse, even when I finally had the leverage to. Milo's award, by the way, was never actually in question, not for 1 second, not by anyone who mattered. The competition's judging panel, once they learned about the public comment at the ceremony, reached out to me directly, unprompted, offering to provide written confirmation of the scoring rubric and the independent anonymized judging process. Milo's project had gone through the same process every entrant went through. Their lead coordinator, a soft-spoken engineer named Fareed Bashara, who ran the regional program on a volunteer basis, told me over the phone that entries were scored using project identification numbers only, with no student or parent names visible, to any judge until after final scores were locked, specifically to prevent exactly the kind of accusation Deanna had made. He offered to send me the anonymized scoring sheet showing Milo's project ranked highest across all 5 judges independently, before any names were ever attached to a single score. I didn't ask him to do that either. I think by that point, enough people had quietly decided the accusation deserved a paper trail of its own, one that had nothing to do with the foundation at all, simply because it was the right thing to put on record. I kept that scoring sheet, folded once, in the same drawer where I eventually filed everything else from that year. Not because I needed to prove anything to anyone anymore, but because I wanted Milo, someday, years from now, to be able to see for himself in black and white that the thing his aunt said in that auditorium was never anything more than noise, aimed in the wrong direction. I didn't ask them to do that. I think they simply wanted it on record, the same instinct I've come to believe that drives a lot of people once they've watched an accusation land somewhere it clearly shouldn't have. I want to describe what our house looks like now, several months later, because I think that's ultimately what this story is actually about. Our mother, for what it's worth, took a long time to accept any of it. She called me twice in the weeks after the board vote, both times asking if there was still a way to fix this quietly for the family's sake. The same phrase she'd used my entire life whenever a disagreement threatened to become visible. I told her, gently but clearly, that quietly was exactly how this had been allowed to happen for over a year, and that I wasn't willing to trade my son's dignity or our father's actual legacy for one more round of quiet. She didn't have a response to that. We speak occasionally now, carefully, mostly about small things, and I've stopped expecting her to fully take my side the way I once needed her to. That expectation, I've come to realize, was its own kind of quiet surrender I no longer needed to keep making. Deanna and I don't speak. Not out of anger exactly, though there's certainly some of that still sitting quietly somewhere in me. We don't speak because there isn't currently anything left to build a conversation on top of. She reached out once, about 2 months after the board meeting, a short message asking if we could talk like adults about what happened. I sat with that message for a full day before responding, and when I finally did, I told her the same thing I'd been telling myself all along, that talking had never once, in over 30 years, actually changed the pattern between us, and that I wasn't interested in another conversation that ended with me quietly absorbing whatever version of events made her most comfortable. She didn't respond after that, and I haven't heard from her since. The foundation continues, run now by a newly appointed co-director, a former teacher our father had mentored years earlier, someone with no family ties to either of us at all, which somehow feels like exactly what he would have wanted, even though I know he never imagined it would come to that. Milo's trophy sits on a shelf in his room, not center stage, not turned into some symbol of vindication, just a trophy a 12-year-old boy earned for a robotics project he spent 4 months building, in our garage on weekends. He asked me once, a few weeks after the ceremony, why Aunt Deanna said what she said. I told him some people have a hard time feeling good about their own life when someone near them is doing well, and that it usually says a lot more about them than it ever says about the person they're aiming it at. He thought about that for a moment and said, "That's kind of sad, actually." I told him I thought so too. I think a lot now about the difference between revenge and self-respect, because people who hear stories like this sometimes assume they're the same thing. They aren't. Revenge would have been standing back up on that stage the moment Deanna handed over the microphone and telling 300 people exactly what I already suspected about the foundation's missing money, using my son's award ceremony as the setting for her downfall the same way she'd tried to use it as the setting for his humiliation. I didn't do that, and I'm glad I didn't. Self-respect was quieter. It was requesting a forensic review instead of a public argument. It was sending a formal notice instead of a furious text. It was letting a room full of people who actually cared about what our father built decide, calmly, with documents in front of them, what the truth actually was, instead of letting either of us decide it out loud in front of an audience that had nothing to do with any of it. I still think sometimes about that auditorium, the bright lights catching the dust above the stage, my son's face freezing mid-smile as his own aunt tried to make his achievement sound like a crime. I understand now that the comment was never really about Milo at all. It was about a woman who knew, somewhere underneath all that charm, that a formal notice was already sitting in her inbox, and who reached out of habit for the only tool she'd ever really used against me, making something good sound smaller, hoping the noise of an accusation would arrive before the evidence did. It didn't. The evidence had already been finished for days by the time she picked up that microphone. It was simply waiting for its own moment, on its own timeline, in a room built for facts instead of performance. I think, too, about how much easier it would have been to let that microphone moment simply pass, to laugh it off the way our mother always wanted family friction laughed off, to let Deanna's comment dissolve into the general noise of a school auditorium, and never once connect it to the $43,000 quietly missing from my father's life's work. It would have cost me nothing anyone could immediately see. A slightly awkward evening, a story people forgot by the following week. But I understood, sitting in that boardroom listening to Priya read routing numbers off a projector screen, that easy and honest have never actually been the same thing in my family, and that I had spent over 30 years choosing easy because somewhere along the way I mistook it for peace. It wasn't peace. It was just the shape our silence had always taken, and silence, I've learned, can quietly cost you everything if nobody ever stops to add it up. There's a version of the story where I never checked that spreadsheet 14 months before Milo's ceremony, where I accept Deanna's explanation about a small clerical thing and move on the way I'd moved on from every accusation and every quiet theft of credit for 30 years before that. In that version, the foundation keeps bleeding a little more every year, my nephew's scholarship stays exactly where it never should have been, and somewhere down the line, maybe at another ceremony, maybe at another family dinner, the same pattern finds a new place to land. I think about that version sometimes, not with fear exactly, but with a kind of quiet gratitude that I finally stopped being the person who let it. So here's my question for you, the one I genuinely want an answer to in the comments. Have you ever watched someone in your own family try to shrink something good that happened to you? And if you have, what finally made you stop letting them get away with it? Tell me honestly, I read every single comment. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. If any part of it felt familiar in a way you weren't quite expecting, please consider liking this video and subscribing, because these stories only keep reaching the people who need to hear them if viewers like you decide they're worth sharing. I'll see you in the next one.